My name is Joelle Castiex, and I am a survivor of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. And now I devote my career to being a national spokesperson and advocate on behalf of those abused as children in religious and institutional settings. I volunteer as the Western Regional Director of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, and I also work with a few other nonprofits, including the National Center for Victims of Crime and the Institute of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, helping break the cycle, expose abuse, and punish wrongdoers. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce just briefly the members of our panel, and we'll let each of them speak more in depth about why they're here and what they do, and give us all a call to action and a lot to think about child safety, about institutional sexual abuse, and about what we can do to ensure that something like this never happens again. The first person here is Michael D'Antonio, the author of the book Mortal Sins. Next to him is M.L. Daniel. She's an ordained minister and attorney and works with the Faith Trust Institute, helping religious institutions deal with sexual abuse in a pastoral manner. Next to her is Mary Dispenza. Mary Dispenza is an activist, an author, and a victim of childhood sexual abuse. And she has devoted her life and career to helping others and making sure that Seattle is as safe as it can possibly be. And then next to her is Tim Casnoff. And Tim is an attorney here in the Seattle area. He's been representing victims of childhood sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, and other organizations for more than 20 years. Currently, he represents more than 200 victims of sexual abuse in the Pacific Northwest, young men and women who were abused as children on Indian reservations. So we'll start with Michael.
So my work as an author usually revolves around histories and biographies. I actually did a book in Washington State about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in the early 1990s. And I've had the good fortune to grow into a writer who can go to publishers and say, this is an important topic, it hasn't been dealt with thoroughly, let's do something. And usually they say yes. And sometimes they'll say yes when it's a very serious topic. In the case of the sexual abuse crisis and scandal in the Catholic bureaucracy, and I'm not going to say that it's in the Catholic Church because the church is the people. It's a bureaucracy that has enabled clerics to abuse children and covered up their crimes. And again, it's not a sin, it's a crime. It goes back centuries. And the modern crisis began in the early 1980s when on both ends of the Mississippi, parents brought complaints about what had happened to their children to attorneys. And there just happened to be two ornery attorneys, one in Louisiana and one in Minnesota, who refused to believe that you couldn't sue the Catholic Church, the institutional church. And they pressed those cases. And in both instances, they got the truth out. And the truth turned out to be just as bad as the child victims said it was. And it was compounded by cover-up and transfer of the offender to new parishes where he offended again, in both cases. This was shocking news in America in 1985 when it broke in Time magazine. It was also shocking news at the Vatican Embassy in Washington. And this Catholic institution is interesting for a lot of reasons. One is it has 1.2 billion members. Another is that it's the oldest continuous global institution in existence. And the third is that it's a nation as well as a religion. So they have an embassy in Washington. And they employed a staff, and on that staff was a man named Father Tom Doyle. And Pio Laghi, who I remember because I was a reporter in Washington when he showed up, flipped a file across the desk one morning and said, Tom, take a look into this. And his intention was that Tom would resolve it. In fact, Tom didn't resolve it. He investigated, and what he discovered was that it wasn't just an isolated case, but that there was a system-wide problem, that in virtually all of the 200 dioceses in the United States, there were offenders, there were cover-ups, and there were transfers. He worked with an attorney and a fellow priest who was also a psychiatrist to write a big, thick report. And the report in 1986 said, there's a looming crisis. We should do something about it. Children are in danger. It's going to cost us at least $1 billion if we don't get ahead of this. Let's stop this. And they put it on the shelf. So we're now talking 1986. They could have implemented a plan, they could have done the investigation, they could have begun the genuine process of resolving this crisis, and they didn't. And every time there's a new scandal that erupts, or a new release of documents, there's a link to both Tom Doyle's original work and to this tendency or this institutional lockstep approach of denial, cover-up, and then trying to fight against whoever wants the truth. Now, many years have passed since then, and I report in the book very detailed stories about landmark cases. I've been in communities where folks say, well, why didn't you put our community in? Because we had a scandal too, or we had 100 scandals. And the truth is, there were so many going on that I could have written 4 books. What I did was look for those cases where the cause of justice was advanced, where new information came out, where opportunities for change were typically lost, but sometimes achieved, and the story would move forward. And it covers the 30-year span, actually more than 30 years, of this crisis. I look at the links between the church's teaching on sexuality, the status of clergy who are regarded as something other than human once they're ordained. And there's a code that seems to take hold of this group, and they close ranks and protect each other, even at the expense of the people who are in the church. And it also revolves around the moral authority of Catholic leaders. I've had people be really both amused and startled to see that I begin the book in 1870. And the opening scene is the Italian army bombarding the walls of the Vatican. Because at that moment, the Pope's real territorial claims ended. Italy was reunited, but he was confined to the acreage of the Vatican. And it was at that moment that, approximately that moment, that they declared the Pope infallible. He wasn't always infallible. It was 1870, that's not long ago. All of this was in order to establish the church as not an empire of land, but as a moral empire. They were going to exercise their influence and power as a moral authority. And the ultimate result of this scandal for the institutional church is that it's lost that status. It's no longer the beacon of morality, the symbol of Christianity in the world. It's now regarded as a human institution with all of the problems and all of the frailty and all of the difficulties that all institutions face. Ultimately, I think I have a very hopeful message, and that is that people who tell the truth can actually change the world. I'm a big critic sometimes of technology that races past me, and the older and balder and grayer I get, the more I worry about keeping up. But the internet changed everything, where the cause of humanity is concerned, especially in the fight for human rights. If you have as much information as they have, and now we all have almost as much information as they have because everything can be shared globally and instantaneously, you can then advocate. Remarkable as it sounds, mortal sins, sex crime in the era of Catholic scandal is actually a hopeful work. It is inspiring. The people that you meet in it will amaze you, from Tom Doyle to very courageous attorneys to individuals who were victimized and claimed survivorship because they went from victim to victory. And without them, I couldn't have told the story, and the world would not be as good a place as it is. So thank you for coming, and I'll answer any questions after the rest of the panel can speak.
Good evening. This is like church. Good evening. You know, ministers always want to know that there's somebody out there. My name is M.L. Daniel, and I'm an ordained minister with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I'm also work with Faith Trust Institute. And the work we do at Faith Trust Institute is really working with the institution itself to begin to become more responsive when these complaints have come in. How do we help our institutions to begin to live into who they say they are, who we think they are, and when these complaints come in, how do we respond effectively when the complaint has come in? And there's several things that institutions can do, and part of what we do is we work with institutions across the spectrum. We don't work with just Catholics or Protestants. We work with the Buddhists and the Hindus, and so it's not unique. Unfortunately, it's a crisis that has infected every faith tradition, and there's a response that needs to be had from the faith community itself, holding those who we have placed in leadership accountable. And so the work we do really works around what are the clergy boundaries that are being violated? How do we frame the questions so we can begin to hold those leaders accountable? And how do we respond faithfully out of our traditions when there's been a violation? Because it's not just the individual who's been victimized. Our attempt really is to work with institutions so they don't continue to re-victimize individuals, but they are indeed those faith communities that we have come to love and respect and to follow so that they can be those beacons in the community. And so we do a tremendous amount of work around policy work. To how does your policy reflect what your theology is and who you say you are in this world and who you desire to be? And so we work in that regards to how can we really begin to work with our traditions. And there's traditions and there's sacred text in every tradition that speaks to what it means to be a leader and what your role is, and so that you're not violating those who you have been given the trust of, and how you're not re-abusing, and how institutions could be more effective in that regards. And so that's part of what I'm hoping to add to the conversation tonight is the larger question around institutional responsibility and responsiveness, and how we can be more effective in that, and how those of us in the pews can begin to hold the institutions accountable when they fail to do and represent the image or the vision that we have of who we are as people of faith, regardless of what your faith tradition is, as people of faith. How do we hold those institutions responsible, and how do we begin to work so that when there's a complaint that comes forward and there's an abuse victim, we don't re-victimize them, but we begin the healing process so that it can actually move forward and take place.
My name is Mary Dispenza, and I was sexually violated by a priest when I was 7. And I buried it for many, many years until I was about 52. I think because of the shame, and also I believe subconsciously I knew if I let it surface, I would have to leave something that I really loved, and it was a Catholic church. That was my life, my container, a way for me to use my gifts and talents, and I didn't want to let it go. I'm sure that's a piece of it too. But finally, in 2006, my case was settled, and I stayed away from SNAP for a long time, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, because I thought it was about church. I mean, church in the sense that I didn't want to fight church, I didn't want to work against it. I just didn't want to be a part of it. And then somehow SNAP found me. It just finds you. You know how things have a way of finding you? So SNAP found me, and then I began to see that really SNAP is about protecting children. And my life has been about protecting children. If I look around the room and try to tell you who I am or what I've been, I see the person I worked with in a preschool serving low-income families. I see my dear friends from PFLAG. By the way, you all know this is Pride Week, and this is the end of it, so what a wonderful night, because the church, too, puts so much shame on persons for how they love and for issues of sexuality. So it's kind of all come together for me. And I'm proud to be here, and I thank all my friends. I believe I know almost everybody in the room, and this makes me so happy. Thank you.
My name is Tim Casnoff. I'm an attorney here in Seattle. My first case was happened by complete accident. I was pretty demoralized and burned out in the practice of law, but wasn't qualified to do anything else. And maybe it was doubtful whether I was qualified to even do that. But a young man came into my office and told me the story of how he had been victimized by an elder in the LDS church, and how through what subsequently was discovered, that church leaders had known about this elder and had covered it up and had allowed him to continue to molest children. I thought it was a 1 in a million case, a faith institution that would knowingly enable a molester to continue to prey upon children. In fact, as I investigated further, they served children up to him. That led me on a journey of about 5 years in which the Mormon Church sicked an army of lawyers that fought me across 7 states where I tried to uncover evidence. And it was true. They knew. And what's more is they defended what they did on First Amendment grounds. They claimed that they had a First Amendment right to believe in repentance, and when they forgave Frank Curtis, that meant that his sins were washed clean and they couldn't hold his past transgressions against him. Eventually, they paid what was then the largest settlement of an individual sex abuse claim that had ever been reported in the United States, and it happened to be my very first civil case. I didn't know what the civil rules of procedure were prior to that, but I had a pretty good nose for investigating, and it really became a transformative mission for me in my life. It enabled me to find purpose professionally, and it fed a need to be a white knight and to be a champion for somebody. And after that, I couldn't go back to what I did before. And so I determined that I was only going to represent survivors of child sexual abuse. And then 6 months after that, Constance Sweeney, a judge in Boston, ordered the Boston Archdiocese to turn over and to make public all of the files on the known abusers in the Boston Archdiocese. And the Boston papers put them up online, and there everybody could see for the first time what people like Jeff Anderson and Tom Doyle and others of the pioneers that were out there, lone voices in the wilderness, people like Snap, Barbara Blaine, and David Clossie, who people were not listening to. There they could see in black and white. It was true. Suddenly, I was a lawyer here in Seattle with just a solo practitioner, and I was inundated with cases. People who sought me out because I was the only one around that seemed to have experience in handling these kinds of cases. And I teamed with other lawyers, and I learned from other lawyers, including people like Jeff Anderson and Steve Rubino and others that had been handling these cases around the country. And I came to see what Michael's book makes clear. This was a system. This wasn't an individual case of bad judgment or a lapse. This was a system, and now we know as a result of documents coming out in Europe and around the world that it was a worldwide system. I've gotten past my own anger and wanting to see this institution leveled to a point where I know it's going to be there long after I'm gone, and that the discussion needs to move forward from here. I believe that there are individuals who are rising within the church who, while their loyalty will always be to the church in Rome, they are desperately looking for solutions out of these mass tort cases that they're now confronting, increasingly so all across the United States, which threaten the financial existence of the church. And so I've been recently, in the last couple of years, encouraged by one-on-one dialogues that I've had with various bishops who I think are wanting to do the right thing, but who have been raised and are working in an impossible system that is one that has placed the highest premium on the importance of the priest, of the cleric, and virtually no importance on the role of the layperson, the parishioner, and the children. And so it's not about sexual abuse so much as the abuse of power. And how the Catholic Church reforms itself or resolves, I think, will be determined by the people in the pews ultimately who decide what kind of church this is going to be. If that doesn't happen, if there is not a reformation, I predict that the church, at least in the United States, will cease to exist as we know it. These claims are catastrophic injury claims. My cases settle on average in the neighborhood of $400,000 to $600,000. There's not enough insurance or assets to pay claims of that nature, and yet this was an institution that manufactured tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of victims just over the last 50 years. And the documents show that this has been a system that's been going on for more than a millennia.
I was wondering what kind of focus you or your organization or your program has on helping survivors to heal.
That's basically where they got their start, was that there was a sexual abuse victim that called up and was asking for some assistance. And part of what launched that ministry was the idea that the faith community wasn't there to be supportive. And so the healing part of what we do, at least from the institutional side, the part that I work on specifically, is geared more towards helping institutions begin to see that you can start that healing process long before you need to call the attorney. We can begin to offer some procedures and put things in place that allows individuals to begin that healing process without the need of seeking legal advice or seeking legal counsel or going through the litigation process. And part of that really is asking the victim what is it that they need to begin that healing process. And I don't think that's something that most institutions actually do. When they receive a complaint, part of that healing process is asking them, what do you need?
Right.
What do you need? What can we do to help you begin that process to heal from this? We acknowledge that it happened. We're not going to re-victimize you, but what can we do to help you begin that healing process and then to provide it? And part of that really is helping institutions to put together what they need so that they can actually do that. And to help them recognize that you cannot hand over your policies to your attorneys to write your policies, because your policies really do need to reflect the traditions that you're living out of.
I've been walking with survivors for about 18 years, and most are as interested in going to the Roman Catholic Church, and the people I work with or walk with, they're about as interested in going to the Roman Catholic Church for healing as a survivor of Auschwitz would be interested in going to a Nazi doctor. So like when you have that type of an aversion, where do you go? What has to happen? And that's something I'm working on and thinking about, and I just wanted to ask you, what you were doing in your specific areas, because I really didn't understand what you were, or would like to know more about what you're doing. So thank you.
You're welcome.
A little something to add to that. I've noticed that the survivors that I've met have all forged their own path. That people seem to use advocacy. They want to be the person who helps others and stands up. They use truth-telling. They want the world to know what happened to them, especially other Catholics. They use psychotherapy. It does seem to me, though, that ML's idea that we have to ask them, and they have to be given the resources. The most tragic case that I saw, at least in terms of lifelong effects, was actually Jeff Anderson's first case, and he was the lawyer in Minnesota. And I met that young, well, he's now older man, who was the first one in the country to be public about what had happened to him. And he got $1 million settlement, ran through it all in drugs and alcohol and parties in about a year and a half. And he now lives off in the woods in Alabama and is afraid to let the world know him. So I think that, this healing part, and people need to be respected and invited and encouraged and given all the options possible, because the devastation from this crime is overwhelming.
Well, and I'll add to that too. I mean, I know very few victims who did not go to the church first. I went to the church first. I reported, and I said that this teacher sexually abused me, and I think school administrators knew about it and covered it up. And I wrote this letter. I still have a copy of it that I wrote in 2001. And instead of doing the right thing, they tried to manipulate me, and they tried to keep me close and keep me quiet. And I was able to see through it, but it took about a year. And had there been something in place where they had said, well, gosh, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's look at the file. Let's see what we have. Let's report this teacher to the authorities. Let's alert the community that this happened. Then, things would have been so much different.
My name is Jim Patton. I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and I'm well aware that clergy abuse happens in all denominations. I'm just curious, do you think that forced celibacy for the Catholic Church has made child molestation so more prevalent in that denomination than in other denominations? And is the Church trying to deal with possibly opening up clergy to be able to be married? Would that solve some of this problem, or would it just push sexual abuse to other adults?
This is something that I looked at in depth because I wanted to track the history of what's been known. And I was really, again, startled by how much the church has known that these supposedly celibate men were abusing children. It goes back more than 1,000 years, the record on it. In the 1950s, there was a priest who devoted himself to this problem, and he wrote to the Pope and said, I put a down payment on an island, I want to put them all on it. And he really had done that. He didn't get the funds to complete the purchase, but it was an island in the Caribbean, and he described these men as vipers. And later, in the late 1960s, there was a report that was requested by the Pope and delivered by 2 European psychiatrists who are experts in sexual behavior, and they began the conversation about who wants to be a celibate priest. And what they warned of was that there were men who had real developmental problems, who probably were inclined toward pedophilia, who sought the celibate life as a shelter, but then later used it as a cover for this activity. Another report came in the 1970s that it said exactly the same thing and was even more explicit. And then I write about a fellow named Richard Sipe, who was a priest and monk who became a psychotherapist and had thousands of files on these men. And he identified the link between celibacy, sexual secrecy, and abuse. So there is despite the protestations to the contrary, a big issue with celibate clergy. And Richard has noted that he believes that 1 or 2% of celibates really practice celibacy through their ministry, throughout their ministry, and that in any given year, 50% violate their vows. I actually am sort of hopeful that there may be married priests sooner under Pope Francis than there would have been with another man, because he comes from South America where it seems like every other priest has a family. and they know that you can minister successfully, and so I don't think he's shocked by this concept. It's not the whole problem, but it really contributes. The other element that I want to mention is this mutual blackmail that takes place. So if I break my vow of celibacy by having a relationship with an adult, I confess it, and I'm forgiven. And the priest I confess to confesses to me that he broke his vow of celibacy with a 10-year-old. So now who's going to speak? And this is multiplied when there were 60,000 priests in America by 60,000 priests, with everybody confessing to everybody else and everybody having something on everybody else. So I do think that there is a terrible problem with celibacy and this whole issue of secrecy.
Since there's more openness about the sexual abuse and all things are going on, would you say now, in 2013, there is less sexual abuse in the Catholic Church than, let's say, 50 years ago, 20 years ago? I know there's a lot of cases that, happened years ago that are brought up. I had brought one up, a lot of people, but now are children as much being abused who are children now?
Well, I would hope it's less, if only because of the elevation of awareness that's taken place as a result of efforts like SNAP and others. But there's a long latency period. Children live in shame, and they feel stigmatized, they feel bad about it, and the natural response, what scientists that have discovered the child sexual abuse syndrome tell us, is that it's relatively rare for children to disclose unless they're under the appropriate circumstances where they feel safe and where they feel that they will be believed, and that if they tell, that their abuser will be held accountable. Those are three big things. But absent that, children will keep the secret, often well into adulthood, and then the coping mechanisms that allowed them to keep this contained, to keep it a secret, break down. And they'll become symptomatic for the first time, sometimes in their 30s, 40s, or even 50s, when exposed to a story or something that triggers their memories that they've kept locked away for so long. So I guess the answer is we won't know until those people come forward 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, to what extent it's changed.
I believe that children are more likely now to understand a lot about abuse because, as a child in the 70s, it just wasn't talked about, whereas my son, he's 7, and he's being raised to be empowered about his body. He doesn't know anything about sex, but he knows that people don't touch him, he doesn't touch other people, no one takes pictures of you, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the Catholic Church, I do believe they've put some policies in place. I don't know how effective they are. But what is telling to me is, for example, in Los Angeles, the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Archdiocese of Los Angeles has spent to keep documents secret that were promised in 2007. And so you can't predict the future, and you can't predict even the present when you don't know what exactly is going on. However, if you look at the behavior of the institution, you can really only assume the worst in this particular situation and say, yeah, you know, it's probably still going on because they're fighting far too hard to keep documents secret.
My question is there any work being done to separate pedophilia from homosexuality?
Well, that's a really important question. We were talking about that earlier today. The church bureaucrats and their supporters have tried very hard to paint this as a problem of homosexuality. Mm-hmm. They want to say that it's gay priests and that these, in fact, I interviewed an archbishop who's gay and is out. And he told me, well, these are seductive young people. Mm. So they really don't get it, that this is not about that. What I think is really hopeful, though, is that society is moving past these guys. Mm-hmm. You know, do you all know this guy, Bill Donahue, who runs something, right? He's in the book. I interviewed him at length. Just as an aside, and I didn't put this in the book, but he had a very racy picture of Miley Cyrus on his desk while we met.
Wow.
And he kept glancing down at it and saying, "Did you see this in the paper? It's terrible." Well, no, I didn't notice it in the paper, and why do you have it on your desk? Bill told me, you know, we've lost it on the gay issue. And I said, really? What do you mean? He said, well, the kids are against us. The future is, we've lost that fight. So I think it really doesn't matter what the advocates for the church's position say. I think public knowledge is racing past them, as it did with Proposition 8, and is going to do with all of humanity. And so I think work is being done. It's just not being done by them.
And I think it's also a big argument that the church uses to disenfranchise the female victims, because I mean, look at me and look at Mary, and you look at the founders of the early survivors movement were women, and by saying there's a gay problem, it completely disenfranchises survivors like Mary and I, who are just as victimized, but because of Catholic tradition are then scuttled away.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're really talking about sexuality in relationship to homosexuals and in relationship to abuse. The church carries or creates shame. And I believe shame and secrecy are the basis of this perpetuating. So if a little child in especially Catholic school isn't free to talk or learn or express attitudes and issues and ask questions about sex, it remains this hidden dark secret, something to be ashamed of and something to be feared. And I think that's a fundamental problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, from the priests that I've interviewed and deposed who were abusers, they had very immature, dysfunctional notions of sexuality that had frozen them in time to when they went to minor seminary, maybe at age 13 or 14. And then they go through this tradition where one was telling me how he left the priesthood, but when he was in Rome and he was in the dorm, he was introduced the first day, there was a dresser with this little object that looked like a fan, and he didn't understand what it was for. And they explained to him that that was for tucking his shirt in to his pants so that there'd be no danger of his hand touching himself as he was tucking his shirt in, which would be almost laughable, except that this was in the 1960s. It gives you a sense of what a repressive culture it is. I think the important thing is that if a person has an impulse towards somebody who is a minor, they may not necessarily be a pedophile, But that's child molestation, and we have laws that criminalize that behavior. But in an institution, well, you'll be protected if you engage in that kind of conduct. You won't be turned over to the police, and you'll be hidden. Then if you're sexually repressed and frustrated otherwise, aren't you going to act out on those individuals that you have access to, and you can safely release whatever sexual urges you have? So I think it comes back to a question of power rather than pedophilia in many instances, although I also deal with just clear pedophiles that have a clear preference for prepubescent children. They are out there.
It's more of an observation I'd like you to comment on. I have been on the front lines of this for 25 years. They call me a first-generation survivor. My qualifier for this particular discussion was I was molested by a priest while I was in an orphanage when I was a child, among others. And by the way, pertinent to the conversation, he ended up leaving the priesthood, getting married, and having 3 children. So his orientation in adulthood was heterosexual. 25 years ago, any gathering, there are very few, was a rage-filled, angry, screaming festival of hatred for the Catholic Church. I'm not saying this out of criticism. I'm saying this, that's where we were, for good reason. We were not heard. We had no power. We could not affect change. And the lawyers were just starting to figure out there was money to be made, and to do good work too, sir. But I'm cynical in my old age, having dealt with the church for this long. I am, as I was during everything that happened at Penn State, so grateful for the enormity of the change in our society. I am watching you people talk about good things that have happened. I am looking at organizations that are educating. I did a lot of radio work. I knew a lot of people in town. I was on all the time during Penn State, and they'd have me on, and I'd say, hey, this is garden variety child molestation. I've been dealing with this forever. There's nothing unusual about it, other than the prominence of Joe Paterno. What is unusual is how society and the jocks and the guys are coming together and saying, not on our watch, not on our time. All the things we have been working for, folks, we are getting. All the screaming and all the work and all the power and all the pain and all the time showing up. It's not just that there was nothing there wasn't even a book for men when I started the work. We have effected a change in society. All of you here have effected a fundamental change in how we deal with children. And just watching you people talk. Yeah, we're irritated with the church, and yeah, they still piss us off, and yeah, they're still playing the same games, but that rage, that helplessness, that feeling of impotence to affect anything is not in this room right now. And that's what I wanted to comment on and ask you to comment on your own appreciation of the good things that we've managed to accomplish. And thank you all very much for helping me too.
I think each of us could address this. I really think it's amazing. There has been a profound change caused by this human rights movement, and it is worldwide. I visit Ireland in my book, and Belgium, and England, and there are cases happening in Australia that are actually being taken up by the Australian national government. There is really no place on earth where people aren't aware of this. I was in Iceland on a completely different project, and someone said, what else do you do? And I mentioned this book. And they said, oh, we've had that problem here, and we've dealt with it. So it is a remarkable change in 30 years, and it's really the victims of Catholic priests who started this all off, aided by a lot of others. There was great work done at universities, and even people like Oprah Winfrey, who talked about stuff that we weren't supposed to talk about. And each little bit adds up to growth and development. And my book ultimately is a celebration of what real people can do against powerful institutions to protect kids.
I agree with you that the change that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years, I never expected to happen this soon. But that said, I think we have a long way to go. And in that regard, so much of the work has been done by survivors, their advocates, writers, the media. What we have not seen in this country is meaningful action by our elected representatives. Our prosecutors have been pathetic in this country. There have been a few courageous ones that have stood up and done the right thing, but in this county, this elected prosecutor and his predecessor sat weekly having tea and cake with the Archbishop, sitting on his advisory committee, when they should have been convening a statewide grand jury investigating these bishops in this state. I don't see Mr. Satterberg in the audience, but I've written about him and have spoken about him, and he should be ashamed of himself. When bishops hear the clank of the jail cell door shutting behind them, you will see change. Lawyers like myself can only do so much. There's limits to civil subpoena power. If I could convene a grand jury, I could do a whole lot more, but I don't have that power. And so my message is, prosecutors, wake up. Children in this country need you. The perpetrators have always been there, and they always will be there. The only way we're going to protect kids is to go after the enablers. I'd like to see mandatory reporting laws that carry felony sentences. If you have reason to believe that a child is being abused, sexually abused, and you fail to report it, you should be facing a minimum of 3 years in prison.
Yeah, and to add to that, you know, we have to remember that in Kansas City, there's a bishop there named Robert Finn, and Robert Finn pled guilty to misdemeanor child endangerment last year. He's still the bishop. He has not been removed, he has not been censured, he's not been punished. So.
Comes to the question of institutions getting serious about dealing with their own, as opposed to allowing the courts to deal with their own. Getting serious about responsibility of holding your own accountable and having systems in place where you began to do that, as opposed to moving them from place to place to place, as opposed to really addressing what's going on with that particular individual. And so I think it's a two-sided coin, where the institutions need to be really serious about getting, having punishments for their own and dealing with their own. And when that's done, that the court system really then should come in and do its piece as well. So it really should be a two-pronged system.
I think that Tim's comment about prosecutions is really important, because states have tried civil windows, and they've opened up the opportunity for people to sue and recover money, and the number is now $3 billion that has been paid to people who have been abused. But that can only do so much. And I agree that, you know, in Philadelphia, they convened 3 different grand juries, and they've issued reports, and they got some results. And that does speak to the broader issue. And in too many places, the leaders of the church are very much intertwined with the leaders of the community and with political leaders, and that dynamic still exists, and only the people can change that.
For the attorney, is there going to be a case for pedophiles where there's no, what do you call it, where there's a timeout? I mean, there's a running time? Limitations, that's it, yes.
Several states around the country, California was one of the first to abolish the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution of child molesters, and under that law, they prosecuted cases many decades old. I believe there was something on the order of 800 convictions and incarcerations of pedophiles. a case from California wound its way to the United States Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that the elimination of the criminal statute of limitations violated the ex post facto clause of the U.S. Constitution, and all of those pedophiles were released. And so the rule, constitutional rule is you can pass such a law, but it only affects those crimes going forward in time and can't go back in time. The civil statute of limitations in most states is not affected by the ex post facto clause. A civil statute of limitations is merely a device to keep old claims out of court because of proof problems and so forth, and because the courts are busy enough without having to take on cases that are oftentimes many decades old. The legislature of this state was one of the first back in 1989 to recognize that there has to be an exception for that rule in the case of child sexual abuse survivors, because oftentimes they don't even realize that what happened to them was child sexual abuse, or if they do, they have not discovered their emotional and psychological injuries. Why? Because we now know that these are progressive, debilitating injuries that manifest over a long period of time. And so a person may think that they're doing just fine, only to fall apart in their mid-30s and not have any reason to understand what's happening to them. And that's the profile that I see of so many of my clients. So increasingly you're seeing states extending the law, passing what are called discovery statutes of limitation, allowing the individual, when they discover their injuries, to come forward, whether or not that's 5, 10, 15, 20 years forward. And that's why you're seeing in places like California and other places these cases coming forward, while in other states you're not seeing any cases, and it's because those people are shut out of the courthouse because of civil statutes of limitation. So it's not only a question of fairness to these victims to have their day in court, but I think even more important, it's a question of profound public safety. Why do I say that? Because who knows who the perpetrators are in this community? The survivors. And unless they can come forward and file a lawsuit and identify their abusers, nobody in the community knows who they are. Most of these guys never get caught. They have no criminal histories. They're very cagey. I've had perpetrators that have abused hundreds, never been convicted, oftentimes held out as being pillars of the community. They're very, very difficult to identify. There's a lot that we can do to make our society safer, and one of them is by taking away the civil statutes of limitations so that survivors can come forward, contact an attorney, and bring their case and identify that perpetrator. If we saw more of that, I think you would see an increase in public safety in a way that our current system just doesn't deal with it.
That's only civil, not criminal.
On civil, but it's still a good idea to eliminate the criminal statutes of limitations so that at least going forward, a perpetrator knows that he can never wait out the victim, and that if that victim comes forward at age 20 or 30 or 40, that he still faces, or she faces in some cases, criminal prosecution. And I've had cases where the perpetrators kept their eye on the calendar. They were acutely aware.
Do you ever think we'll get to the day where the bishop that transferred these people will be criminally prosecuted and the president? Because I thought about it earlier when you were talking. Do you think you will ever get to the day that the bishop that transferred these guys, because I know one guy that I was brought up here at First Hill at St. James, one guy was transferred several times, that the bishop that transferred that guy, knowing what he's done, can be prosecuted criminally, and that the guy that's doing the priest, can be also prosecuted criminally?
Not retroactively for the
No,
reasons.
but we're going to get to that day because it's not being done today.
It's not being done today, but it's a good point. And one last point, and it sounds technical, but it's really important. Our mandatory reporting laws in this state and in most states are misdemeanors or gross misdemeanors, which means they're punishable by up to a year in jail at most. Because they're a gross misdemeanor, it means they have a civil statute of limitation of only 2 years. So until the individual comes forward, which can be many years later, by the time the state becomes aware that there was a bishop or a clergyman that covered up and concealed and didn't report to the police, it's too late to prosecute that clergyman because more than 2 years has passed. So they should take away the statute of limitations for failure to report as well.
Can I dovetail on that just for a hot second? We were talking about how you can have multiple offenses and never know about it in a single community. Part of what we do in our work and what we've discovered as the years have gone by is that part of that is the result of settlement arrangements where there's been a secrecy or confidentiality clause where nobody gets to talk about it. And that's part of the work that we do is to discourage institutions against that, to allow victims the right and survivors the right to talk about what took place for them. And that would begin the process of individuals no longer being allowed to go from one to the other without the public being aware of what's going on. And that's part of the settlement conversation that attorneys have. Is that?
Well, in my case, I will never sign a confidentiality agreement except as to the monetary amount, since oftentimes that's irrelevant, but the existence of the lawsuit, the fact of the settlement, that's never going to be confidential. And when my client signs a fee agreement, it says in there that if it can only settle with the signing of a confidentiality agreement, then the case won't settle. So my client knows up front what the deal is. We're not going to accept money for secrecy. That's rule number one. But two, the damn things ought to be illegal and unethical across the board, whether you're settling with the church or a pharmaceutical company or somebody that's done something else. The fact they've engaged in that kind of behavior, and I realize that secrecy facilitates settlements and eases the burden of the courts, but it is a gross violation of the public interest and trust to keep these kinds of things swept under the rug. And it's not just in sexual abuse, it's across the board.